ever feel like you're just like bombarded with all this information about CPTSD? It can be
Hmm.
so overwhelming. So we're doing a deep dive today into Peter Walker's work
Okay.
and specifically focusing on chapter 12
Right.
to give you some clarity on this idea of abandonment depression.
Yeah.
And we are so lucky to have with us today a clinical psychologist
Thank you.
who brings incredible insight to
Yeah.
this, often really misunderstood
Yeah.
aspect of CPTSD.
Absolutely.
So Walker dives deep into this idea of abandonment depression as
Mm.
like this core issue in complex PTSD.
Yeah.
And he's really clear that this is not your everyday sadness, right?
No, not at all.
This is something much deeper. It's about this primal fear of being alone and
Yeah.
unsafe.
Absolutely.
And it can trigger this whole cascade of reactions in our system.
It really can. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on this from your professional experience?
Yeah. It's so interesting because he really does map out
Mm-hmm.
these reactions so brilliantly.
Yeah.
It's like this cascade, as you said,
Mm-hmm.
that starts with this just deep, visceral feeling of being abandoned,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't even have to be some big dramatic event.
Right.
Sometimes it's something seemingly insignificant, right? Like
Mm.
a friend cancels plans or, somebody doesn't text you back right away.
Right.
And suddenly you can feel like this emotional tidal wave, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of fear and shame.
Right.
And that's when that inner critic often jumps in to make things even worse.
Ugh, the inner critic. Right. That voice can be so brutal, but I can see how that ties into those fight, flight, freeze, or fawn responses. Like,
Ah,
our nervous system is just desperate to escape from these feelings, even if it leads us to some pretty unhealthy coping mechanisms.
yeah, absolutely. What's interesting about that is that that cycle can actually work in the reverse as well.
Oh,
So
interesting.
you might find yourself maybe reacting
Mm.
in one of those four ways, right?
Right.
Maybe snapping at a loved one or just shutting down completely in a meeting.
Right.
And then suddenly the self-awareness hits, right?
Right.
And then boom, the inner critic just pounces
Right.
and it just amplifies that fear and shame. And it makes that sense of abandonment feel even more overwhelming.
So it just becomes this awful cycle, this self-perpetuating cycle.
Absolutely.
So with all of this reactivity swirling around inside us, where does mindfulness fit into this whole thing?
Yeah.
Because, it's incredibly difficult to be mindful when you're in the eye of that emotional hurricane.
You're telling me, it's one thing to say, oh, just be mindful.
Right.
But it's another thing to actually do it. And this is where I think Walker's emphasis on somatic mindfulness is so powerful. Because instead of trying to think our way out of these feelings, he's saying, let's turn towards the physical sensations of fear and shame, even the numbness that can accompany depression.
So instead of saying to myself, like, just calm down,
Right.
when I feel that familiar panic starting to bubble up,
Yeah,
you're saying I should be focusing on where I feel that in my body.
exactly.
That almost feels counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? It's a practice. And it can be challenging, I'm not going to lie.
Right.
But what I appreciate so much about Walker is that he's really honest about his own struggles with this.
Okay.
He talks about how, for him, focusing on those physical sensations instead of getting swept away by that mental chatter,
Right.
the what ifs and the self-blame,
Right. Right.
that's actually what helped him to process and release those emotions more effectively.
That reminds me of something else he talks about, which is the difference between depressed thinking and feeling depressed. It's
Yeah.
like we're so quick to slap a negative label on any sort of sadness or low energy that we might be experiencing. But what I hear you saying, and what Walker really emphasizes, is that sometimes those feelings are there to tell us something. They're carrying a message.
They're trying to tell us something.
If we're willing to listen.
Exactly. And that's where I think self-compassion becomes so important.
Hmm.
If we can approach those feelings with curiosity instead of judgment, just asking ourselves, what is this sadness trying to tell me? What need might this be pointing to? We open ourselves up to a whole new level of understanding.
It could be a sign that we need rest or a change in our lives or even just a moment of gentle acknowledgement for what we've been through. Right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that permission to actually feel those feelings is so important.
It's huge. It's everything.
It's a key ingredient in healing.
It is. And Walker doesn't just talk about these concepts in the abstract. Like, he gives a really interesting example in chapter 12 where he uses this cooking analogy
Okay.
to illustrate how even something as ordinary as being in a busy kitchen can be a major trigger for someone with CPTSD. Have you ever noticed that? Like, maybe you're just trying to get dinner ready and suddenly it's like everything feels overwhelming.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's like my nervous system just decides that a sink full of dishes is an insurmountable obstacle.
Yes,
And I'm right back in that childhood feeling of chaos and overwhelm.
that's exactly what he describes. He talks about having panic attacks
Wow.
triggered by a full sink of dishes
Oh,
or like struggling to open a jar. And for someone without CPTSD, those might seem like minor inconveniences.
right.
But for someone who's constantly on high alert, right,
Right.
from past trauma, those can be experienced as genuine threats
Wow.
to their sense of safety and control.
It just shows how sensitive and reactive our nervous systems can be when we're carrying those old wounds.
It does.
So how does he suggest we manage in those moments?
Well, he actually walks us through his process of like managing a flashback in action.
Yeah.
It's actually very practical.
Okay.
So he talks about, first of all, recognizing the signs,
Yeah.
right? Like noticing, okay, this is happening. And then he talks about grounding himself
Hmm.
by actually feeling the physical sensations of anxiety and then even using self-talk to kind of counter that inner critic.
Mm.
So he's basically offering a roadmap for how to navigate those moments.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's such a good point because he doesn't just leave us hanging. He's giving us the tools, which is so important.
Exactly.
I'm curious, though, what he says about those moments where our reaction feels totally out of proportion to the situation.
Right.
Because, I think there's that fear of, am I overreacting?
Right.
Should I even be this upset about this jar that won't open?
Yeah, that is so common. And I think he addresses that beautifully
Yeah.
because he talks about the importance of grieving in those moments.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And it's not just about grieving the original trauma,
Uh-huh.
but it's also grieving the fact that this seemingly small thing
Right.
is triggering such a big reaction in the present.
Right.
It makes sense, though, if you really think about it.
It does, because it's like acknowledging that your reaction is valid,
Mm-hmm.
even if it doesn't seem rational on the surface.
Right.
There's a lot of compassion there for that inner child who learned to react that way for a reason.
Right. It's about acknowledging the reality of our past experiences
Yes.
and how they've shaped us,
Absolutely.
but not getting stuck there. Exactly. Exactly.
And that over time, that compassionate awareness can actually help to rewire those automatic responses.
It can. It can. And, he's not saying we're going to eliminate them entirely,
Right?
because I think that's often an unrealistic expectation.
Right.
But it's about creating more space
Yes.
between the trigger and the reaction.
That space is everything.
It is.
That's where the magic happens.
Yes. Yes. It's about learning to respond rather than just react.
It's huge. I love that.
Yeah. And, that actually leads us to his distinction between necessary suffering and unnecessary suffering, which I think is really fascinating.
Okay, yeah, tell me more about that. What's the difference? And how does that apply to what we're talking about?
Well, he makes the point that some suffering is just part of life.
Right.
We're going to feel fear and sadness and grief. Like that's just part of being human.
Right.
And he calls that necessary suffering. But the unnecessary suffering, that comes from these reactive patterns that we were just talking about, the self-abandonment and the inner critic attacks and those frantic attempts to escape the feeling.
Okay.
Like those are the cycles that we can actually learn to interrupt.
So it's not about, becoming some emotionless robot who never experiences anything negative.
Right.
It's about learning to ride the waves
Exactly.
without getting completely swept away, you know?
Yeah, exactly. It's like we're building new neural pathways.
Mm.
We're teaching our nervous systems that we're safe now,
Right.
even when those uncomfortable feelings come up.
Right.
And that takes time and it takes practice,
Absolutely.
but it's possible.
And this is where those tools like somatic mindfulness come in.
Yes.
Right,
Yeah.
where we talked about really tuning into those physical sensations.
Exactly. He talks about it as like coming home to the body, becoming this compassionate observer of your own experience.
I love that. Yeah, it's so powerful.
And as we practice that, what happens? We start to notice those subtle cues that a flashback might be coming on.
Oh, it's
Right. Maybe it's that tightness in your chest or your heart starts to race or you just get this urge to flee.
right.
Right. And those become our opportunities to intervene
Right.
before we get completely hijacked by the old patterns.
It's like we're developing an early warning system
Yes.
for our own well-being,
I love that. Like we're becoming fluent in the language of our nervous system.
Yes, exactly.
Right. The more we practice, the more we understand those signals,
Right.
and then we learn how to respond to them with care instead of judgment.
Yes, that is so important. One thing I wanted to circle back to that Walker talks about is this concept of emotional exhaustion being mistaken for physical fatigue.
Yes.
And he calls that pseudocyclothemia. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. That is something that I see so often in my practice.
Okay.
And when I read his description of it, it just really resonated with me.
Okay.
So he uses this term, pseudocyclothemia, to kind of differentiate it from bipolar disorder. Because the symptoms can actually look really similar on the surface.
Interesting.
Right. But what happens is you're feeling exhausted, right?
Right.
But instead of resting, we tend to push ourselves harder.
Right.
We blame the fatigue on laziness or lack of motivation.
Right. Which just makes it worse, right?
Exactly. We try to outrun it, but it just intensifies,
Right.
and we end up feeling even more emotionally drained and depleted.
It's like this constant undercurrent of tiredness.
Yes.
But it's not just from lack of sleep or overdoing it.
Right.
It's something deeper. It's like this unprocessed trauma.
It's like we're carrying it in our bodies.
And tragically, we're often taught to ignore that,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
Like tiredness equals weakness.
And we have to just power through it,
Yeah.
which of course just perpetuates the cycle.
And I think underneath all of that striving, there's this deep longing for rest, this
There.
desire for permission to slow down and to tend to our wounds and to just give ourselves that care that we maybe never received.
And those unmet needs are so real and they're so valid.
Mm-hmm.
It breaks my heart to see people punishing themselves for needing those things.
And it's in those moments, I think, where self-compassion becomes even more important.
Absolutely.
Right. It's about noticing, okay, I'm feeling fatigued, maybe a little irritable.
Right.
Maybe I'm reaching for those comfort foods a little more often than usual.
Yes, the cravings.
Which, speaking of, is something else that Walker talks about that I found really fascinating.
Three more.
This connection between emotional hunger and food.
Yeah. He talks about how those cravings, especially for comfort foods, can actually be a sign that we're craving something much deeper. Like that sense of safety and nurturing and connection that we maybe missed out on.
It's like those cravings are trying to soothe those old wounds of abandonment,
So much sense, right. And even the act of preparing food can become really loaded for someone with CPTSD.
Oh, wow.
He talks about, the dishes piling up or struggling to open a jar. Like those seemingly small things can feel insurmountable.
Right, because our systems are on high alert.
Exactly. They're like little landmines in our everyday lives.
It's amazing how these everyday things can become a battleground
It's-
for our deepest wounds.
Right. And that's why it's so important to approach them with awareness and compassion, like you're saying.
Exactly. And that's what I love about Walker's work is that he teaches us to do that.
Yes.
He's saying, let's recognize these patterns.
Bring them into the light.
Yeah, let's shine a light on them.
Yes.
And then respond in ways that nurture us.
Yes. Instead of perpetuating that cycle of suffering.
Yes. It's about learning to become a safe haven for ourselves.
Yes, I love that.
Even in the midst of all of these difficult emotions, right?
Beautifully said.
Yeah, and it's like we've internalized those early messages, that our needs were too much, that we weren't worthy of that care.
Yeah.
And those messages can run so deep.
They do. They really do. And it's one thing to understand that intellectually, right? But to really feel it in our bodies, in our nervous systems, like
Right.
we have to almost create a new lived experience that contradicts those old beliefs.
And that's where Walker's emphasis on the somatic work is so important.
Yes.
Because it's not just about thinking our way out of these patterns.
It's about feeling our way through.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And he gives us such practical tools for that.
He does.
Remember that example about the cooking flashback?
Mm.
He talks about literally putting his hands on his stomach, feeling that tension and just breathing into it.
Right.
He's not trying to make the feeling go away.
Right.
He's just choosing to be present with it.
There's something so profound about that physical connection,
It is.
It's like offering a kind of internal embrace to those parts of ourselves that are hurting.
It is. It's like saying, I see you, I feel you, and you're safe with me. He doesn't stop there.
Right.
He also talks about, challenging the inner critic in those moments, grieving those original wounds, and even setting boundaries with those internalized voices of his parents,
Wow.
Like he gives us a whole toolkit for interrupting that cycle and cultivating self-compassion.
It is. It's like a toolkit.
It
And
is.
I love that you call it that because it really is. It's like he's saying, here are the steps.
Mm,
This is what I do when I get triggered.
right.
You can do it too, you know?
Yes, absolutely. And I think what I appreciate so much about his approach is it's not about, like, never being triggered again.
Right.
Because, let's be real, that's pretty unrealistic for most of us.
Right.
It's about meeting ourselves where we are with kindness
Yeah.
and understanding that with practice, those moments of reactivity will become fewer and farther between.
It's a journey. It's not like we reach this destination and then we're done.
Exactly.
Right.
It's,
A journey.
mhm.
And like any journey, there are going to be bumps along the way.
Absolutely.
But having those tools, having those practices to come back to
Yes.
makes all the difference.
It does. It makes all the difference. And maybe the most important takeaway from Walker's work is that you're not alone in this.
Yes.
So many of us carry these wounds, these
Right.
patterns, this
The
reactivity.
power to being human, right?
It is.
Especially if we've experienced trauma.
But by shining a light on these things, by
Yeah.
bringing them into the light of awareness and compassion, we can begin to heal.
And maybe even by sharing our journeys with each other, right?
Yeah.
However imperfect and messy they might be,
Yes.
we offer that same hope and healing to other people.
Absolutely.
It's about breaking the silence
Yeah.
and reminding each other that we're in this together.
Beautifully said.
It is so powerful to just know that we're not alone.
It is.
And on that note, if this deep dive has resonated with you, we encourage you to check out Peter Walker's book, Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving. Chapter 12 is a great place to start. Until next time, take care.